The tugboat captain had seen a lot of strange things on the James River. Nothing like this. Ahead of him, stretching for miles, sat more than 2,000 ships. Grey steel hulls, anchored gunwale to gunwale, so close together you could barely see water between them. No smoke from the funnels. No crews on the decks. Just silence, and the slow creak of steel settling against steel. A few years earlier, these same ships had been crossing the Atlantic under fire, dodging U-boats, carrying the tanks and ammunition and men that actually won a war. Now they sat here, engines cold, waiting for orders that for almost all of them were never going to come. The locals already had a name for it. They called it the Ghost Fleet. Nearly 3,000 of these ships had been built in less time than most navies take just to finish the blueprints. Within a single generation, all but 2 of them would disappear completely. This is how that happened, and why almost nobody outside a handful of engineers and historians ever noticed it happen at all. Go back to 1941, and the idea itself sounds almost reckless. America needed cargo ships, fast. Not comfortable ones, not fast ones, not pretty ones, just ships that could cross an ocean carrying supplies, built quicker than German U-boats could sink them. The design that came out of that pressure was about as stripped down as a ship could get, welded instead of riveted wherever possible to shave weeks off construction. Engineers openly called it a 5-year vessel, expendable if it had to be. Nobody expected these ships to last. Critics at the time weren't shy about their doubts. Newspapers mocked the design as ugly, slow, and cheaply made, a dreadful-looking object, in the words of one contemporary skeptic. President Roosevelt himself reportedly called the class ugly ducklings when the first ones came off the line. The name stuck, half insult, half fact, but an ugly ship that could be built in weeks instead of months was exactly what a country racing against torpedoes needed. And the doubts didn't slow the shipyards down for a single day. Then American shipyards did something almost nobody predicted. They built 2,751 of them. For a while it was the largest class of ocean-going ship the world had ever seen. Convoys of them crossed the Atlantic loaded with everything an army needed to survive a war. Around 200 never made it, lost to torpedoes, storms, accidents. But that still left when the guns finally went quiet, well over 2,500 hulls afloat, ships built to last 5 years at most, and a peacetime country that suddenly had no idea what to do with most of them. You can't just scrap 2,500 ships overnight. And in 1946, with memories of the war still raw, nobody wanted to either. What if there was another emergency? What if the country needed this kind of instant shipping capacity again and had thrown it all away? So Congress did something almost as strange as building the fleet in the first place. It created a program to freeze time, to take these 5-year ships and try to make them last indefinitely just in case. They called it mothballing, and it was far more involved than the name suggests. Crews sealed every hatch and vent they could find. They ran dehumidifiers through the interior spaces around the clock, fighting the salt air that would otherwise eat through exposed steel in a matter of weeks. Machinery got coated in thick protective grease. On many ships, workers built strange plywood domes over the deck openings. Locals called them igloos, sealing the ship's insides away from weather it would. In theory, never actually sail through again. The promise behind all of it was simple. Any ship in this fleet could be back at sea within 20 to 120 days, ready for whatever crisis came next. And for a little while, that promise actually held. When the Korean War broke out, the Navy reached back into this frozen fleet and pulled out over 500 ships exactly as planned. Engines that hadn't turned in years came back to life. So it worked. For a few years after that, in the early 1950s, it must have felt like the whole enormous investment had justified itself. The fleet had done exactly what it was built to do. Somewhere on the James River and out at Suisun Bay in California, planners could look at those rows of grey hulls and tell themselves this had all been worth it. A strategic reserve, ready and waiting exactly as designed, but Korea ended. And the ships that didn't get called back just kept sitting there. Year after year, decade after decade, nobody had built these ships to survive that long, mothballed or not. The paint went first. Layers of it, loaded with lead and copper and zinc, meant to protect the hulls for a handful of wartime years, started flaking away after 2 decades of sun and salt water. Nobody had planned for that either. For what all that lead and heavy metal would eventually Due to the river and the bay these ships were anchored in, the Timothy, riveted seams held together well enough for a 5-year lifespan. They did not hold up nearly as well across 20 years, or 30, and the ships themselves, frozen in 1941 technology, started looking almost like relics next to the diesel-powered, container-carrying giants the rest of the shipping world had moved on to build. A modest 10,000-ton Liberty ship, once the backbone of a global war effort, had quietly become something closer to a museum piece still floating at anchor, waiting for a war that showed no sign of coming back. There was another problem too, one nobody in 1946 had thought to plan for. All that flaking lead paint didn't just disappear into the air. It settled into the water below the hulls decade after decade, until regulators finally had to step in and treat what had once been a strategic asset as an active environmental hazard. A fleet built to defend the country was, by the final years of its life, something the country needed defending from. The first one to go to the breakers was the Patrick Henry, the very first Liberty ship ever built, the one that had once been paraded in front of cameras and crowds as a symbol of American industrial might. In October 1958, it went to the scrapyard almost without anyone noticing. No parade this time, no cameras. That was the pattern for the next 15 years, quiet, gradual. One ship at a time, then a few, then dozens. As the wave of scrapping picked up speed through the early 1970s, the hulls that had rusted too far to save it all simply went to the torches. The math had become inescapable. These ships cost more to preserve than they were ever likely to be worth again. Not every ending was quite so ordinary, though one ship, already written off as a total loss, got painted bright chrome yellow and handed over to the Navy as a target for early guided missile tests. It ran aground off Cape Cod not long after, and stayed there for decades, rusting quietly in shallow water, visible from the beach to anyone who happened to look. Another ship went even further, from anything its original builders could have imagined. Workers gutted its cargo holds and installed a working nuclear reactor inside. 45 megawatts of power, generating electricity down at the Panama Canal for years. When that job finished, the reactor came out, and the ship went right back to the reserve fleet at James River, anchored quietly among the ordinary Liberty ships around it, as if nothing unusual had ever happened to it at all. By the time the scrapping wound down, the numbers told their own story. Of the 2,551 Liberty ships built to help win the Second World War, only 2 remain today, anywhere close to their original condition. One sits in San Francisco, the other in Baltimore. Both still occasionally raise steam and carry passengers on commemorative voyages, engines running exactly the way they did when they crossed a wartime Atlantic. Both survived only because dedicated preservation groups stepped in and pulled them out of the ordinary path toward the breakers, not because any government program set out to save them. The James River Reserve. Fleet itself never fully disappeared. A handful of ships remain anchored there even now, a small quiet remnant of an anchorage that once, on a single morning in 1950, held more ships than most entire nations' navies. Somewhere in that dwindling handful of survivors sits a lesson that has nothing to do with rust or steel. A weapon of war, however brilliantly designed for its moment, doesn't get to choose how long it's needed. The Liberty ship was built to answer one specific, desperate emergency, and it answered that emergency spectacularly. What came afterward, the decades of quiet anchorage, the flaking paint, the slow procession to the scrapyard, was never really a failure of the ships themselves. It was simply what happens to almost anything, however extraordinary, once the world it was built for has moved on without it. 2,751 ships, built faster than anyone thought possible, to win a war nobody could have won alone. And in the end, it took less than one generation for almost every single one of them to simply vanish.